We are going to talk all about identifying people's faces, having good facial recognition, knowing people's names based on their faces, and why this is such a deficit for autistic people, and how we as practitioners can address it and teach it. My name is Carrie Woodward. I'm a board-certified behavior analyst, and I have been working with autistic children and adults and their families for over 20 years now. Given their immense social importance, it is not so surprising that newborns, only 30 minutes old, show a preference for faces over other non-face objects. However, solely attending to faces in the environment is not enough. In everyday life, it is essential that we identify faces at the level of the individual. That is, we should recognize that this is John's face, rather than simply a man's face or a human face. One of the core features of autism are deficits in the areas of social interaction and communication. We know that autistic people spend a lot less time looking at other people. They make eye contact less often. They look at people less frequently. And this actual difference in the way that they look at people is present at birth. So this quote from a journal article is talking about neurotypical babies, how within the first 30 minutes of life, they are already gravitating their gaze toward looking at people's faces. But for autistic infants, this is not the case. They are not spending nearly as much time looking at people's faces. We know this based on infant research studies that actually look at where their eyes are pointing when presented with two different screens. One screen that has a person's face and another screen that has objects. From infancy, babies that will go on to receive a diagnosis of autism spend significantly less time looking at the people's faces as they do looking at objects. And this extends into our everyday life. Looking at people is valuable for learning. This is where we are picking up on language learning. This is where we are picking up on social learning. And so if autistic babies aren't spending enough time looking at people, they're often missing out on this critical learning. And this extends into identifying individual people's faces. If you know an autistic child, or if you've worked with autistic children, you may recognize that at times it can be difficult that they would look at a person and maybe call them by the wrong name. Or maybe they just can't remember the person's name and they've known the person forever. This is a common feature for autistic people, and we want to talk a little bit about why, and then also as a practitioner, what we could be doing in order to strengthen this skill for our children. My desire to jump into this topic stemmed from working with children who struggled with identifying people, especially people that they knew and they saw often, and developing strategies that were successful in helping them achieve being able to discriminate different people in their life. But when I jumped into reading a lot of the literature on this, there's a ton of traditional psychological literature about facial recognition. And so there's often ways that this is described that don't really comport to the way that a behavior analyst would describe it. So let's talk a little bit about what I'm seeing in the literature. Children with autism have difficulty with their long-term memory for faces. Children with ASD process faces less holistically than typically developing children. Children with ASD do not seem to have a typical holistic face processing strategy. People with ASD tend to avoid processing the eye region when they're looking at the face. You'll notice that the term processing gets thrown around often in the way that traditional psychology talks about this understanding of how a whole face works. And the word processing is quite popular in the fields of neuroscience and psychology education. We talk about processing a lot. And there is absolutely no doubt that there is a lot of processes happening when a person sees another person's face, takes in all of the information from the face, and is able to identify that person or put a name to the face. However, as a behavior analyst, I can't measure processing. Unless we're actually studying brain waves or imaging when a child is seeing a person, it's all sort of an assumption that we're making. And I'm not discounting that processing is happening or that it's very important in how this procedure works. I'm just saying, as a behavior analyst, there are other things that we can be looking at, and to inform why this is a deficit and what we can be doing to help strengthen it. As my mentor, the amazing Dr. Hank Schlinger, would say, what's the most parsimonious explanation? And this just means, what's the explanation that requires the least amount of assumption? So I can't measure processing. I can't observe processing. I certainly can't take data on processing. And so let's talk about these phrases that we've used to describe the deficit in facial recognition, and let's talk about it in a behavior analytic way with things that are observable and measurable. Children with ASD process faces less holistically than typically developing children. Okay, so they process it less holistically. What this simply means is that a child is not necessarily attending to the full face with all of its features combined as one whole, but they're attending to a part of the whole. Maybe they're focused on the nose. Maybe they're focused on the cheek. It's like a child who enjoys watching wheels spin on a car. They're looking at the wheel and they're not necessarily taking in the car as a whole. And so if we're not processing the face holistically, that means that certain features on the face are extending stimulus control as opposed to the whole face with all of its features combined. People with ASD tend to avoid processing the eye region of the face. And again, this just means what variables are controlling a child's response? What parts of the face are exerting control? Is the child even attending to the face for long enough for any of those features to exert control over what their response is going to be when they say hello? Is the problem that autistic people are not processing certain parts of the face or are processing it non-holistically? Or is it that they're not attending to features of the face long enough for any of those features to begin to control the discrimination response of knowing that this person is John and this person is Megan? As I dove into the behavior analytic research on facial recognition, I was met with a ton of research on emotional recognition, right? So this is that core feature for autistic people that have a difficulty in reading other people's emotions, understanding facial expressions and what emotion that facial expression is attempting to portray, but not necessarily on the actual recognition of different people, discriminating person A from person B to person C. Of course, if you've worked with a population of autistic children or adults, you recognize that there is this lack of ability to be able to understand different types of emotions. And this is something that's very easily observable when we go and see a child in a school setting. And maybe the child is playing with a friend and they do something that upsets that friend, that they're not recognizing that their friend is upset. And so then they're not changing their behavior or they're not trying to fix the problem. And that's what would happen in a neurotypical peer set, right? Is that they're reading each other during a play interaction and they're modifying or adjusting their behavior based on how their friend is perceiving them. Or you see two children that are playing a game together, and when the autistic child wins the game, they celebrate, they're super happy, and they don't see that their friend looks disappointed and sad, and they don't tailor their behavior to adjust to seeing their friend disappointed. And so as a behavior analyst, we say, I got it. My kid doesn't understand this emotion. So let's just do flashcards to teach this emotion so that my child will then start to understand when they see this face, it means this emotion. And there's endless research on teaching autistic children how to recognize other people's emotional responses. But is this the right question that we're asking? Is just teaching our child how to identify different emotional responses going to be enough for them to take this skill into their day-to-day life and use it practically? Even if they do, is recognizing an emotion going to be enough for them to then change their behavior or use that information to adjust their behavior moving forward? And why is this skill so difficult for our autistic children? I spend a lot of time talking about the general field of behavior analysis and their approach to supporting autistic children by helping to teach them skills that are missing from their repertoires. They teach endless skills. And my philosophy is that if we could get to the core issue of why that skill is missing and solidify that core issue, then we can stop having to teach thousands of individual skills, and instead we could get our children to learn a bit more naturally. If you've been working with autistic children for a while, you're pretty well aware of the DSM criteria for the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder and its core features of a deficit in social interaction and communication. There are some day-to-day manifestations of these deficits that you'd be familiar with if you spend a lot of time working with autistic children. A lack of eye contact, not responding to their name, seemingly in their own world, doesn't understand emotions, doesn't recognize facial expressions, doesn't pick up on subtle cues. And the thing that all of these have in common is that they all relate to people's faces. The early infant research studies in autism are showing us that from infancy, autistic babies are spending a lot less time looking at people and at people's faces than neurotypical babies. And is all this time missed looking at faces that sort of leads to these core deficits in being able to identify people's facial features, facial expressions, and emotions that are happening at the face. And while we can acknowledge that there is likely genetic and neurological underlyings for this discrepancy in their behavior, there are behavioral ways that we can attack this to teach the skill and strengthen the neurological processes underlying the skill. So you see, as we engage in behavior, we sort of build bridges within the brain, these neural connections. And the more times that we practice and rehearse these behaviors, the stronger the neural connections get, especially during the first 3 years of life. So if we can spend a lot of time bringing these babies' attention more focused onto people's faces, the underlying neural connections for social behavior begin to be strengthened. But what happens beyond that? What happens beyond age 3? How are we working to bring children's focus more into people's faces so that we can teach them these valuable skills? Have you ever worked with a client that just had the hardest time remembering people's names? People that they saw all of the time, therapists that were on their teams that would walk through the door, and they just couldn't remember their names. There are a ton of published studies that document and demonstrate this difference in the way that autistic people have a memory for faces or are processing faces. However, if we simply say that it's a memory problem, then we can't do anything about it. The memory is a place in the brain that nobody has access to. And I think discussing it in terms of memory misses a huge problem, which is that if children aren't looking at faces enough, it's not a memory problem. They just haven't attended to the face long enough for those features to exert control over the response of saying that person's name. If somebody is telling me that this person is John, but I'm not looking at John's face to start the relationship between John's face and the name John, then it means nothing. I'm not attending to the face enough to have it become salient and to evoke the response of me saying John. So it's not necessarily a memory problem. It's that they're just not spending enough time looking at the face in order for the face to be meaningful for them. Let's see if we can break this problem down using a behavior analytic explanation to it. We have our child, Jack, and Jack has Mark, a therapist, on his therapy team. He sees Mark every single day. He sees Mark a lot more often than any of the other therapists on his team. Mark comes to school with him, he spends the day with him at school, and he also sees him at home. Jack only sees the other two therapists on his team more sporadically at home. And the therapists on his team have all developed the same routine with him. When they walk through the door, they say, "Hi, Jack," and then they prompt Jack to say hi back to them. Say, "Hi, Mark," and he says, "Hey, Mark," and then they move on about their day. Over time, Jack starts to say hi, Mark, to everybody on the team. Not just Mark, but also to Margot and Monica. And we might think, poor facial processing. He's clearly not able to discriminate between Margot and Mark. Maybe he's not processing the face holistically, or maybe he's got a poor facial memory. But I think what's really happening is that he's not attending to anybody's face. He's not really looking up and spending enough time looking at the face while the prompting is happening. And so what happens is that over time, we have this intraverbal, we have this pattern to the exchange. Hi, Jack. Hi, Mark. Hi, Jack. Hi, Mark. This exchange happens 30 times per week. Hi, Jack. Hi, Margot. Hi, Jack. Hi, Monica happens about 3 times per week. We have an imbalance in how often he's hearing and engaging in the interverbal response, hi, Mark, when he hears hi, Jack. It is obviously reinforced because his behavior technician knows well enough to reinforce this exchange. So we've reinforced a predominantly higher number of learning opportunities of hi, Jack, hi, Mark. And therefore, when he hears hi, Jack, he doesn't need to look up and see a person's face. It's an intraverbal response, meaning there is zero visual control here. It is all auditory control. Hearing hi, Jack evokes the verbal response, hi, Mark. If we simply call this a memory or a processing issue, we ascribe the problem to be an internal process that we don't have any control over and therefore we cannot fix. But when we look at the observable events, when we look about the environmental variables that are responsible for the behavior, it gives us all the power in the world to be able to say, we know what the problem is, and here's how we can work to fix it. But I guess first we really need to have a better understanding of stimulus control. You see, every behavior that we engage in is somehow controlled by different variables in our environment. And this just means these are the things that are present that evoke behavior from us. So, when I'm hungry, hunger is a variable that may evoke a behavior of walking to the refrigerator and looking for food. Behavior analysts look at what variables are present that come before behavior, that set the behavior, that evoke the behavior, that control the behavior. This is called stimulus control. And these variables are all antecedent variables. They're all variables that are present in the environment before a behavior happens. And when we've developed a stable relationship between the variable and the response, meaning every time this variable is present, this response happens, we then say that there's stimulus control. When I see a picture of a cow and I say cow, and I do this repeatedly, we can say that seeing a picture of the cow has control over the response of saying cow. Often, though, behavior can sort of come under the wrong stimulus control. And this just means there's nothing wrong with the behavior. The behavior is simply doing what it's supposed to be doing. But there are different stimuli that are responsible for controlling that response than we want to control the response. So, for the example of the cow, if I see a picture of a cat and I say cow, and I do this reliably, the picture of the cat has control over me saying the word cow. But this isn't right. It's the wrong word for that picture. It doesn't mean it's the wrong behavior. It just means this stimulus, the picture of the cat, has come to control the saying of the word cow. And as a behavior analyst, my job is to identify this and work to transfer stimulus control from the cat to the picture of the cow so that we can get the right response to happen under the right stimulus conditions. So in a simpler explanation, transferring stimulus control just means getting behavior to happen when it's supposed to happen and not happen when it's not supposed to happen. So let's go back to Jack, who is now calling all of his therapists Mark when they walk through the door and say, "Hi, Jack." And so when we look at stimulus control, what's exerting control over Jack's response of "Hi, Mark" is seeing somebody walk through the door and hearing the words, "Hi, Jack." It has nothing to do with the facial features of the face because he's just not looking up and attending to the face. He just has to see a body walk through the door, hear the words, "Hi, Jack," and he has an interverbal response that he says, "Hi, Mark." As a young behavior analyst, this really perplexed me. What's up with Jack? We see Jack all of the time. Why does he still call me Mark? Does he think I look like a boy? I could even see some of the discomfort in some of the younger female technicians on the team when they kept being called Mark. It was sort of this uncomfortable giggle. But when we understand behavior and we understand how behavior comes to happen, you can see how this error began to occur. Not being able to discriminate people or people's faces as a listener or a speaker is just a symptom of a bigger problem. And I bet that the kids that have a hard time discriminating the different people in their life also have a problem with identifying different emotional states on people's faces, reading facial cues, identifying different genders, maybe has a hard time forming peer relationships, doesn't engage in social referencing. Because all of these behaviors are connected, and they're all connected by this idea that if we're not spending enough time looking at faces, we're not going to learn how to engage in these behaviors. And yes, you could see these as all separate, disconnected deficits, and you could work to teach these skills individually to the child. You could write 6 separate goals that all identify these individual behaviors as an area of need and come up with teaching strategies to address teaching these skills to the child. You could drill a million flashcard trials showing up different cartoon picture images of people's facial expressions and teaching the child to tact the emotion on the picture card. Even if that does work, that does not translate well into a natural environment setting. The cartoon pictures do not generalize to what actual people's faces look like. There's so much nuance to a face. Even if you do teach to identify emotions by looking at flashcards, this doesn't really teach cause and effect of why the person might be feeling that way. Being able to take a perspective or inference what's happening to that person, how do they feel, why do they feel that way, what can I do to help that person to be a good friend. These are different skills that will happen down the line. And we only have so much bandwidth as practitioners. We can only teach so many skills. In doing the research for this video, I found this textbook called The Comprehensive Guide to Autism. It has a chapter in the book called Teaching Children with Autism to Recognize Faces. This chapter is written from a traditional psychological perspective, and so it almost needs a translation in order to put it into behavior analytic terminology, but it's super beneficial, and so I'm going to do it for you. So through a ton of the author's research, they've put together this hierarchy. They discuss it as a hierarchical facial processing model. Domain 1, attention to faces. Domain 2A, facial identity. And 2B, facial expression. And then 3, the social meaning of facial cues. This really presents a nice hierarchy that we can use to apply in how we are going to address teaching this skill to our autistic children. And the thing that I think most practitioners are missing is what they put in as domain 1, attention to faces. Most practitioners that I have worked with have done a ton of work on emotional recognition and what the facial expressions mean, but they've never actually done the work to help autistic kids look more often at people's faces, to attend more often to the face. Because if they're not going to attend to the face, they're never going to see the emotions that are happening there naturally anyway. So we do all this work to teach emotional recognition, facial expressions, but if they're not looking at people's faces, they're not going to catch it. What we want to do is teach our kids valuable skills that are going to benefit them in the natural environment, that they're going to use to aid in their success in their life. We do not do this by giving them skills that they're able to perform in a vacuum, meaning only in the very specific way that you taught the skill initially. We need to give them skills that they can take into their life and use. And so we need to understand those skills need to be strong in natural stimulus conditions. And this just means we need them to attend to a face first. If they're ever going to see the emotion there, identify the facial expression, identify the emotion related to that facial expression, and then use that in order to know how they're supposed to respond. All of these valuable skills that we're teaching are useless if we're not doing domain 1 first, of actually getting them to start attending to faces more often. And so when we really break down where the core problem is, this stems back to the whole infant research that shows us that autistic babies are looking at different things than neurotypical babies, and they're spending a lot less time looking at people's faces and at people in general. And when we think about, from a behavior analytic perspective, when we think about reinforcers, we spend time looking at things that function as reinforcers for us. We devote a lot of eye gaze time to things that reinforce us. And so when we look at the things that our autistic kids are looking at, I would bet that those things function as reinforcers for them. The objects that they're drawn to, the toys that they play with, the activities that they engage in function as reinforcers for them. And so that's where they're spending their time looking. We also do know that autistic children are a lot less sensitive to social consequences as reinforcers, which just all sort of goes back to this whole idea that maybe inherently people and faces do not serve as reinforcers for our autistic children. And if we can do reinforcer conditioning work early on in their development, then we may be able to naturally stimulate their desire to look at people, to engage with people, their natural social motivation. If they're not spending time looking at people, they're not giving enough attention to the face in order to really pick up on all of the necessary discrimination to be able to tell the difference between Mark and Margot and Monica. And then let's just touch on this briefly. Doing reinforcer conditioning work in order to establish people and faces to function as a reinforcer for a child is very different than teaching them under instructional control to look at people more often. By saying, look at me, look at them, where are their eyes, find my face, calling their name and getting them to look at your face. These are all looking under instructional control. And what we want to do is to establish looking under motivational control, meaning that we have done the work so that people serve as a reinforcer, and therefore we can create this natural establishing operation in order to look there and gaze there and spend time there. The reason that we move away from this eye contact or looking at faces under instructional control is because we have feedback from the autistic community that shares with us how uncomfortable looking at people is for them. And eye contact makes them feel nervous or anxious. And that's because we haven't done the work to establish those things to serve as reinforcement yet. We're instructing them to look, but they're not doing so under natural motivating conditions. And here's an example that I think may try to paint the picture. Let's talk about money for a second. Money is a generalized conditioned reinforcer, right? This means that money is not inherently reinforcing from birth. It's not one of our primary reinforcers. But it has been paired over time and established as a reinforcer for most people. But if we're talking about young children who have no experience with money yet, money is simply a neutral stimulus. It doesn't probably serve any function for them. It's not motivating, they don't know the value of it, it's not aversive, it's just sort of a neutral stimulus. And we can do a ton of work to try to get our kids to engage with money by giving them instructions. Pick up the money. Touch the money. Anytime that you see money flash on the screen, tap the screen. We're trying to tune them into money. Money is important. We want them to understand money. But all we're doing is we're giving them instructions to engage with money. We're not creating value with money. So though we've done a lot to teach sort of collateral behaviors associated with money, we've done nothing to change the value of money. Money continues to be a neutral stimulus. You're not going to see children seeking out money. You're not going to see them naturally spending more time with money. They've just learned to follow the instructions and learned behaviors that surround money. And so instead, what if we didn't teach any of those behaviors at all, but we devoted our time to actually establishing money as a conditioned reinforcer by pairing it with established reinforcers so that it acquired value naturally? Because when it has value, a child is going to naturally seek it out, naturally pick it up, naturally point to it on a screen because it has inherent value, it functions as a reinforcer. And then you don't actually have to spend time teaching all of these additional skills and behaviors because you've done the core underlying work of creating value where there wasn't value before. And obviously conditioning money to serve as a reinforcer seems a lot more straightforward than conditioning faces and people and social stimuli to serve as reinforcers. But just because it's more difficult doesn't mean that it's not more valuable. Because what if we could save ourselves the time and energy used to teach endless skill after skill after skill after skill, if we could just teach our children to be a bit more in tune to their social environment, be more motivated to engage socially, and then pick up on all the learning that's happening there. And so how do we do it? How do we work to condition social stimuli, people, and faces to function as reinforcers for kids? Well, I'm not sure that there's an established curriculum for this yet. I do know that there's a lot of research to support that it can be done, and there are lots of different strategies and tools that we can utilize to do it. I don't know if there's an age range where it's more beneficial than others. Conventional wisdom tells us that from birth to 3 is when our child's brain plasticity is at its highest, and so it's much easier to make significant change at that period. It doesn't mean that that strategy shouldn't be employed for older children. We should always be working to strengthen our child's natural motivation to engage with their social environment. So here are the ways that I would work to create value in people and in faces and in social stimuli for our autistic children. The list that I'm going to provide you is largely based on Dr. Francesca Degli Espinosa's curriculum on social development. She created a curriculum checklist that sort of goes through a bunch of different listener and speaker behavior repertoires. It essentially takes the VB map and breaks it down into even more nuanced levels. And again, it's sort of a checklist. It's not necessarily a teaching curriculum, but I feel like people use the VB map as a curriculum. They teach to the VB map, and that does not do our kids any favors. The VB map is an assessment tool. It is not meant to guide your programming for your child. Where Dr. Espinosa's curriculum tends to break it down and give you smaller steps in order to teach to a larger goal. And I couldn't find her checklist available for purchase anywhere online, but she does host an annual workshop where she sort of goes through the curriculum and breaks it down for you. I'm going to put the link in the description below in case you wanted to check it out. I find her a brilliant behavior analyst that I've had the privilege to work with. Unique, innovative, creative, different things in the behavior analysis world, and very worthy of checking out and bringing into your practice. So if you're starting out with a fairly young kid, this is where I suggest you begin. Forget teaching hundreds of tact trials. Forget teaching thousands of instructions. spend a significant bulk of your time doing the following things in order to create inherent value in engaging with the social environment, and you're going to cut down teaching time in the future significantly. Sitting across from your child, either at the table or the floor, the adult is in possession of an easy deliverable reinforcer. This could be something edible, a snack, or something that you could easily give over, allow your child to manipulate briefly, and then take back in order to do another opportunity. The child reaches out to collect the item from the adult's hand. Adults should not reach out and give the item, rather require that the child initiate contact by reaching their hand forward and selecting the item out of your hand. What this is doing is that essentially we are creating the motivation for our child to approach us, even if it's at a short distance. They have to bring their hand out and initiate that contact with us in order to retrieve their reinforcer. We are becoming paired with this reinforcer because we have it in our hand. We know we're using an established reinforcer. They are putting their hand out and taking it away from us. In step 2, you'd expand upon this by increasing the distance. So you would stand across the room from your child, having this item in your hand, an established reinforcer, and allowing the child to approach you from a distance, again, reaching out and selecting the item from your hand, as opposed to you reaching it forward and giving it to them. If there's difficulty in your child executing this step, rather than prompting them, just decrease your distance till you can get it established at a shorter distance, and then gradually move back and increase the distance again. Again, what we are doing is we are pairing you with this established reinforcer that your child can approach you, take the reinforcer from your hand, and have it for themselves. Step 3 would be moving back to a closer proximity where you're sitting across from one another. We do the same exact thing, except for this time, the reinforcer becomes contained in your closed fist. And you keep it in the closed fist until your child glances up and finds your face with their eyes.
Okay.
There you go.
I did one.
One big one. This does not need to be eye-to-eye gaze. It does not need to be prolonged eye contact. It just needs to be their eyes glancing up and finding your face. Then you put your hand out, allow your child to reach out and select the item from your hand. We are beginning to bring your face as this component to accessing reinforcement. It becomes this necessary step in order to get the reinforcer. And this close proximity in time is transferring some of the reinforcing qualities of the established reinforcer to your face, which is probably a neutral stimulus. Step 4 is going back to an increased distance, so allowing your child to navigate and travel to you again, and bringing the fist back into the equation. So we separate the distance. The child can see that you have the reinforcer in your hand. You close your fist around it. The child approaches you, glances up, finds your face. You can immediately put your hand out and allow the child to select the item from your hand. In step 5, I would suggest using already mastered skills and putting a pause before you deliver the tangible reinforcer. And doing this before you begin to thin the schedule of reinforcement. So I think in a traditional ABA program, you might teach a skill to mastery using a fixed schedule where you have an FR1, right? Every single response receives access to the reinforcer, receives access to reinforcement. And then we would start to thin the schedule, right? We might move to a variable ratio 2, variable ratio 3. Before you start to thin the schedule, my suggestion would be that once the child completes the task, instead of immediately handing over the tangible reinforcement, we would simply pause and hang on to it and wait for them to glance up, find our face, and then deliver it then. Because they are used to receiving the reinforcement every single time, this pause, this momentary extinction, is most likely going to induce some level of variability in behavior. And oftentimes that's simply looking around like, what's going on? Why didn't I get it? And when their eyes glance up and hit your face, then you present the reinforcement. And what we're doing is we are pairing our face with reinforcement so that we're transferring reinforcing qualities and value to our face. Step 6 would be introducing interactive play chains. This is sort of a crux of a lot of the work that I do, and I don't really have time to go through it all in this video, but essentially what you're doing is you are becoming the element of fun in interactive experiences with your child. We need you to be critical to reinforcement, meaning it's not reinforcing without you. So if you establish a routine with your child while you're playing with blocks, You always stack the blocks in such a way, and then at the very end, you knock it over and it bumps into them, and there's laughter and giggles and fun. Now you're going to start to create a phrase with it so that there's an element of predictability to it. So you say 1 block on top, 2 blocks on top, 3 blocks on top, oh no, they fell, or whatever the phrase is going to be. Create a phrase that's always the same so that when the reinforcing part comes, we know that it's coming because we've done the routine enough, and the words that are associated with the routine always happen in the same way so that when I get to this word, I know the fun part's beginning. And you will know that your child is anticipating the fun part because you're going to see what looks like anticipation of the fun part. They're going to get tense. They're going to get excited. They're laughing. This is when you start to insert a pause right before the fun part and wait for their eyes to find your face. Then you proceed with the fun part. Again, we are creating value and looking at people because that's where fun and reinforcement happens. But also what we're doing is we are becoming the critical integral piece to fun. Meaning that the block building activity wouldn't be fun without you being there. How many times have you watched an RBT doing a session with a child where they're working for tokens and they put the number of tokens on the token board, and when they get to the end, they hand their token board over and the RBT says, great, go ahead, take your break. There's 2 things inherently wrong with this. One, that we want to make sure that whatever the backup is, if you're using some sort of token board or generalized reinforcement system, is that there's an established reinforcer built in there. Taking a break should become synonymous with some proactive strategies that we're using in order to avoid escape behavior in the future. So my suggestion would be save break when you're starting to see precursor behaviors that may lead to escape behavior. Allow your child to ask for it, prompt them to say, I want to take a break, and allow them a break. When they've done the end of the token board, have whatever the reinforcer is already established so that it's paired. But the other problem with this is that they're basically leaving the table and accessing reinforcement independent on their own in a solitary way. It leaves reinforcement as an isolated experience as opposed to doing the work that we're going to do, which is to create a reinforcing interactive experience. We want to join in with their activities. No, we don't want to join in to the extent that it's not reinforcing for them anymore, but we want to insert ourselves into their play, into their favorite activities, and bring in elements where there's motivation for their eyes to glance up and find our face, preparing our face with these already established reinforcers for them. So this is very different from handing over a tangible reinforcer and allowing a child to sort of consume that reinforcer or be with that reinforcer in an independent and solitary way. What we are doing is we are essentially the reinforcement, and it's us that's bringing the value to the activity. Find a lot of different activities that you can do this with. You can do it in any activity as long as you can come up with a routine, some sort of pattern that makes your kid laugh, and that you can then start to insert a pause and wait for their eyes to find your face.
Driving through the town, picking trash up off the ground. Garbage truck, do-do-do. Should we change? Driving through the town, picking trash up off the ground. Garbage truck, do-do-do. Driving through the town, picking trash up off the ground. Garbage truck, do-do-do.
And step 7 in this hierarchy would be manding with looking. We would usually say manding with eye contact, but again, I don't think that eye contact is the most important thing here. It is that your child's eyes are finding your face at some point. So when we're doing mand training, and if you're unfamiliar, mands are simply teaching requests. It is using inherent motivation for an item or activity in order to provide a language opportunity. Our child engages in language and then gets access to that thing that they are motivated for. And this is where language building begins in a verbal behavior approach to language. And oftentimes, young behavior analysts or new RBTs are so focused on providing our kids functional language that they miss out on this important quality of making sure eyes are on the face. Because that's seen as secondary. It's seen as unimportant. What we really want is language. And I agree, we do want language, but also creating that natural motivation to seek out people is what's going to stimulate learning down the line. And so it cannot be something that we throw on the back burner and avoid doing. When our children have learned the word and they're asking for the thing, but they're looking at the thing, we're just pausing and waiting. And they're going to be saying it and looking around, and at some point they're going to say it and their eyes are going to land on your face, and that's when you give it over. So when you have the ball in your hand that they want, that you've been playing with and dropping it down a ball drop, and you have it, a lot of times they may have the language for it, and they're doing this: ball, 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 ball. All you do is hang on to it. We're not prompting. We're not giving instructions. We're just waiting for that brief period of extinction in order to get their eyes on our face before we hand it over. We want their eyes on our face while they are making requests and getting access to reinforcement, so that our face and faces in general are gaining the value that is necessary so that their eyes are seeking out faces more often in the future. So when we go back to the chapter that's giving us the hierarchy and how to teach facial recognition, right? The first domain is attending to faces. And this is where I would begin. That's where I feel like those first 7 steps are really geared toward getting kids to attend to faces more often, and not through instructional control, but through motivational control. Doing that hard work in the beginning is going to bring their attention more and focus on people's faces, because that's what's necessary in order to do anything else in the hierarchy of discriminating facial features, discriminating facial expressions, understanding the emotions that are held there. But if we've gotten kids later in their development, if we've started a program with a child who's maybe 7 or 8, we can do all of the work we want on trying to condition faces and people to function as reinforcement, and we still might have a hard time with it. So let's jump to the next area in the hierarchy. Domain number 2 is facial discrimination. They've divided domain 2 into a part A and a part B. Part A is dealing with facial identity. And from reading the chapter, what I take this to mean is kind of the holistic face, right? That this person, A, is different than this person, B, based on the whole face. And this is where we would have started with Jack, who was having a hard time discriminating Mark, Margot, and Monica. Never mind the fact that their names were all very similar, but even just the fact that their faces were different from each other's. Something else that we need to take into account is that we know that even when autistic people are spending time looking at faces, they may be looking at parts of the face as opposed to taking in all of the features together holistically. So you may have somebody who's looking at a cheek or a chin or a mouth as opposed to seeing all of it put together. What some psychology text might tell us is that these children have a hard time holistically processing a face. But I think what we need to understand is that perhaps there's some stimulus control errors that are happening, and we need to transfer stimulus control from wherever it is now to all of the features of the face. And how do we do that? Well, if you are a BCBA like I was when I first met Jack, you would start a tacting person program. And this just means we would have pictures of the people on his team, and we would hold up the picture and say, "Who is it?" Trying to get him to be able to say the person's name when he sees the whole picture of their face. And we did thousands of trials, and we still could not get discrimination between the pictures of the faces of the therapist on his team. He continued to overgeneralize Mark and continued to get errors with Margot and Monica. Because we're not addressing the holistic piece of it yet. He could still very well just be attending to one small part of the face that looks similar in all 3 pictures. He doesn't have to take in the whole face as a whole. So don't start with tact training. Instead, start with match to sample. And essentially what you're doing is identical picture-to-picture face matching using 3 different people. You'd have a picture of Mark, a picture of Monica, and a picture of Margot out, and then you're providing a matching picture for them to match together, right? It should be relatively straightforward because the comparison stimuli are very different. When you're looking at them all on the table, they do look very different from one another. Now he has one in his hand and he can see, yes, this one goes with this one. So you start with identical face matching using 3 different people. Once you're able to start with that general discrimination, I can now discriminate between Mark, Margot, and Monica. What we really need to do to assure that our child is attending to all of the facial features and looking at the whole face instead of just a piece of the face is then we move into non-identical pictures of the same person. So now you're going to get 3 different pictures of Margot, and you're going to have them out on the array. And you're going to give him a match to just one of those pictures. So this is a much more detailed discrimination. He really needs to be paying attention to the way that the picture looks. Is it smiling or not smiling? Are the eyes open wide or are they squinting forward? There are so many subtle changes on a face. And you can accomplish this very subtle discrimination by using 3 different pictures of the same person. And you would do it with all 3, right? So we'd have 3 different pictures of Mark, 3 different pictures of Margot, and 3 different pictures of Monica. So now he's working on matching these different pictures to each other with a much harder comparison stimuli set, because the comparison stimuli are much more similar than the comparison stimuli when they were different people altogether. In terms of stimulus control, you understand that now we are working to establish stimulus control with the whole face, because the child really needs to be tending to every part of the face and the way that the face is in order to get the response correct. Otherwise, if they're just attending to maybe the eyes may be the same in all 3 pictures because it's the same person. But they really have to be studying the details of all 3 pictures in order to get this correct. Another strategy I would suggest is to throw in the person's name as you're doing this match to sample procedure, because we're essentially pairing what we hope to become an auditory stimulus that has stimulus control with the visual stimulus of this person's face. So you'd hold it up and say Margot, and then he would take the picture and he'd place the picture down. It would be awesome if he's repeating it to himself, maybe overtly or covertly. That would be the ideal scenario. Maybe even prompt him to echo it as he's putting the picture down, so that we are getting this close pairing of the auditory Margot and the visual of Margot's face. And then the third step in this matching procedure is to go back to having an array with all 3 different people. So let's say you have Mark, Monica, and Margot. And for Margot, you're using picture B of her set. She has an A picture, a B picture, and a C picture, right? They're all Margot, but there's 3 different pictures of her. So you have Margot picture B in the sample, and you're going to hand him Margot A to match. So now he's actually matching non-identical but similar pictures. They match better than they would match for Mark or for Monica. And this, again, is just heightening the level of stimulus control using the whole face and the visual discrimination process that's being made when looking at the other pictures in the array. My other note on this would be, make sure that they are just pictures of a face, not a whole body picture, not even the waist up picture, because what we are trying to avoid is having other things exert stimulus control. We don't want random pieces of the picture to start acquiring control. We don't want the fact that her green shirt in picture A is what's controlling that matching response versus the yellow shirt in picture B. We really want it to just be their faces, so that it's the face itself that is exerting control. You can play around with pulling hair up into a ponytail if it's a girl, so that, again, it's not just the hairstyle, but it's actually looking at the person's face that is exerting the control that we want. Before we jump into part B, which is the facial expression, going back into facial identity, this is sort of where I would branch, returning to the problem of hi Jack, hi Mark. Because now, once we have this really good facial discrimination that we've done through the match to sample, I would probably test out a tact response, and you could even use a stimulus equivalence paradigm for this in order to see where they are, the different stimuli on the triangle, and whether or not you get some emerging relations without ever having to directly teach them, right? So we didn't teach tacting. What we did is we did a match to sample where we provided a verbal stimulus, where we said the person's name. If we coached them on how to echo it, then maybe we were pairing this tact response. So then we test to see whether or not the tact is actually established. Holding up the picture, asking who is it, seeing if your child can tact the person without formal teaching on the tact response. Then I would move to the interverbal, the hi. Would we have Mark come back in and say, hi, Jack, and Jack says, hi, Mark. Have Margot come back in and say, hi, Jack, see if we can get, hi, Margot. And that's where I would take it. So we do all of this work before, and then come back and try it again on working on the greetings. So moving into part 2B, which is the facial expressions. And this is simply starting to identify what different expressions on faces mean, being able to discriminate the different expressions and what those different expressions are trying to convey. You can see how working on facial expression identification would be almost impossible if you had not done the first 2 steps first. If I'm not spending time looking at people's faces, I'm not going to be able to discriminate subtleties between a smile and a frown. Those are very subtle features. If I can't discriminate Mark from Monica, I am not going to be able to discriminate a smile from a frown on the same face. If the beginning stages of sadness involve maybe a quivering lip, which is the lower half of the face, and maybe eyes beginning to tear, which is the upper half of the face. You can see where if we're not looking at the whole face and taking it in holistically, if we have not done the work to establish stimulus control with the whole face, then learning these subtle emotional behaviors, learning these subtle emotional responses that happen at the face is going to be nearly impossible. And this is what I run into when I see a child's program, that the child can't even discriminate the therapist on his team, and yet the team is working on emotions flashcards and teaching the child how to attack different emotions by looking at these flashcards. I think one of the problems is that often parents really want us to work on this, right? They want us to teach their children to identify different emotional facial expressions. And so as a clinician, you need to be prepared on how to respond to a parent and discuss the hierarchy and why it's so important to work on these other foundational skills first before moving into emotional recognition. And I think the thing to also explain is how much easier, faster, and more relevant the skill is going to happen for your child if you've done the core work, because now you're not having to do 1,000 trials. Maybe you're having to do 15 or 20 because your kid is already attending to the face. They're already able to discriminate different tiny facial feature changes. So all of that prerequisite work is already established, which makes the work of discriminating different emotional facial expressions so much easier. When working on this facial expression domain, I would like to start with the most naturalistic way, the most natural opportunities for teaching, and then sort of move backward from there if it's too complex in its most natural form. So when we see facial expressions in the wild, they're not static. They're not a frozen picture. They are moving and changing, and there's stuff happening that's dynamic on the face. And so I would always start with video or with like a GIF of a facial expression, because that's the closest you're going to get to seeing it in life. And that's what we would like to be able to control responses of saying sad, happy, scared, anxious. And again, remember, this is just the stage of identifying emotions based on facial expression. Later we get to understanding maybe why that person feels that way, what we can do when we see a person that feels that way. So this is just identifying what the emotions are. So I would start at the video because that's the closest you're going to get to a real person engaging in that emotion in front of them. And if it's too difficult at that level, then take a step back and move to pictures. I would move to real life pictures, pictures of people, magazine pictures, pictures you find online, as opposed to cartoon pictures, because again, that's one more step we need to do in order to get it to be its most natural form. And maybe what you do also is you do the hierarchy of the match to sample, where you do identical to identical, person to person with happy. And then you work on happy versus sad and angry. And then you work on this happy versus this happy versus this happy. Again, just working to make sure that the eye is discriminating very subtle differences on the whole face, and then moving to attacked repertoire. I think that that's giving them a more rounded and a more comprehensive repertoire, as opposed to just sort of identifying and attacking one single picture or two pictures. Obviously you know that you have to do multiple exemplar training, but doing the match to sample procedure as you lead up to tacting, I think helps establish the multiple exemplars before you even get to tax. And I would also suggest utilizing natural opportunities as they present themselves in the environment. So if you're at a school with a child and there's a classmate who's crying, using that opportunity to direct their attention over there and say, "How is Susie feeling right now? Why do you think she's feeling that way?" These natural opportunities are great because they give us a chance to be able to capture when it's happening in real life, what it looks like in real life, and not relying on just videos that we find online. This is also very different from your child learning how to identify their own emotions. So this is tricky because they are not looking at themselves, they're looking at other people. So I would also recommend that you are utilizing opportunities when they present themselves, whether that's capturing video or picture, or just asking your child in that moment when they're obviously expressing one of an obvious emotion, to say, "How are you feeling right now? It looks like you're feeling happy. Say, I'm feeling happy, or I'm excited, or I'm anxious, or I'm feeling sad." People have been reluctant to utilize these natural opportunities when our kids are in a negative emotional state, because we would be providing attention to them in order to have this teaching moment happen. But we also now have research that shows that we do not need to pull our attention away completely if we are utilizing extinction for tangible or escape purposes. Just because we are trying to utilize tangible or escape extinction in a moment, the research is showing us that we can still provide attention in that moment and have our kids and there's still the same level of impact on the behavior. So when your kid's experiencing a negative emotion, feel free to use that as trying to be a teaching opportunity, as long as they're not totally heightened. If they're completely escalated and heightened, teaching moments are gone. They're not available for learning. We know this. But if it's just like a sadness or, a mild negative emotion, use it and say, how are you feeling right now? It looks like you're feeling sad. Can you say, I'm feeling sad? I'm feeling sad. Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry. Why are you feeling sad? Was it because you have to do homework and you don't like it? I'm feeling sad because I'm doing homework. I get it. It's hard. And then you work on, whatever else you're working on. But capitalize and find those natural learning opportunities to provide the language to your child that we're hoping for them to acquire. We want them to be able to describe their internal states. We want them to be able to describe their emotions. And you can capture all the pictures you want in the world of your child and look at it in hindsight. But what's happening is we're missing the internal state that your child is experiencing is that essential, it's an essential variable required to evoke the response of I'm feeling sad. So even if they're looking at a picture of themselves feeling sad, but they're missing that actual natural internal state that accompanies sadness, we have a much weaker response when we're working on it in that way. So I really suggest that you work on giving language to your kids when they're experiencing the emotional state in that moment. And then knowing that the final stage of the hierarchy is the social meaning of facial expressions, I think it's always a good idea to just sort of pair that why, because, the cause and effect during the reinforcement period. So how does that person feel? They feel sad. You're right, they do feel sad. I think that they're sad because they dropped their juice and it spilled. Why are they feeling sad? Because their juice spilled. So this is an important piece to understanding emotions. It's not just about seeing emotions and knowing what they are. That's important. But really being able to take in the cues of what's happened, the contextual cues of the situation, and make some inferences. Or maybe we even saw it happen, right? We saw her spill her juice on the ground. And so now she's crying and she's sad. So we can put that relationship together. But if we didn't see the spill, we just know that there's juice on the floor and she's sad, we have to do some inferencing there. We have to draw some conclusions about a situation that we don't have all the details for. So in the learning process, as we're working on this with our kids, you can add that in as a consequence as you're providing the reinforcement, just as we're giving language to this relationship, the why, the because. This happened, and so this is the outcome. And there's so much that goes into understanding the meaning of facial expressions. I'm not even going to go into it in this video. The only reason I wanted to include it is because I felt like that hierarchy so clearly laid out how it's necessary for it to be cumulative. You have to have these lower foundation skills before you can work on the meaning of facial expressions, what people are trying to convey with their emotions on their face. And I hope as a practitioner, you can now see that we have no business writing goals on, identifying people's subtle cues, picking up on very subtle emotional responses, identifying how people are feeling and what we can do differently. Because if we haven't done the work of those beginning behaviors, then all we're doing is we're working to teach skills that are never going to maintain in the natural environment because we failed to do the establishing work of bringing their attention onto people's faces anyway. And I'm going to leave it there for today. I'm not going to delve any further in because if you are a practitioner who is attacking these topics with your clients, there's so much work to be done in these beginning stages. And if there's enough people who want it, we can film a video in the future about how to begin bridging the gap into real life scenarios, that cause and effect, that inferencing and making predictions, problem solving, all of those very complex social skills that our kids may be needing a little support in. But I think that my main point is that many practitioners jump to those complex social skills because those are the ones that are obviously missing, as opposed to really understanding the nuance of all of the individual subtle behaviors that go into those large complex social skills. And we're never going to be able to teach those complex social skills in a way that's meaningful and relevant, that our kids are going to actually utilize in their natural environment because we've just failed to do all of the work beforehand. So if you have parents that are coming to you and saying, I want my child to do X, Y, or Z, instead of indulging that and teaching a skill for the sake of making a parent happy, explain the process and why it's so important that you work on these beginning skills first, because those later, more complex social skills may more naturally emerge rather than needing to have all of this structured learning in order to get the skill to happen in the natural environment. I hope that you found value in this video and that you can take some of these steps into your day-to-day practice. And I look forward to bringing you along in the next video, learning about all sorts of things, behavior analysis, and autism.